Thank you very much. I always start and I look at the clock, and I like to remind people that in New Zealand it's indeed tomorrow. It's the 4th of November, and I had to come via many time zones to be here, so bear with me. And I hear all these stories and I think, God, I remember that. I remember that rhetoric. I remember that kind of emotional feeling of pitching at a politician, the reasons why we needed sex work decriminalised. I was a sex worker for many years. I also had the pleasure of being arrested and stood up and named and shamed in court. I worked with lots of really stunning, brave, articulate people in the sex industry. We spoke for ourselves. We had to speak for ourselves to get this law changed, and we had to find people who would listen, and that was always difficult. But when we came together in 1987, I remember, I think it was about 1989 or 88, we got a letter from the English Collective, and my gosh, they were onto it. They wrote to us and they said, have you bought into all this AIDS bullshit? What are you doing contracting to the Ministry of Health? And by the way, what do you think about decriminalisation, Nikki Adams? And all these concepts, honestly, we thought, well, it's best if we become like good little Kiwis, put our heads down and just concentrate on what's happening in our country. And I think that's what we did. We sorted out how we could shape decriminalisation, not because we had it intrinsically. You know, we didn't have any models to look at. We had Australia, but they were across the ditch, and, you know, they bowl us out and they play underarm cricket. But anyway, we've kicked them into touch, just as those of you who follow rugby would know. So what I want to talk to you about is lies, because there are lots of lies told about the New Zealand model. Yeah. And I hope I can testify, I hope I can be your evidence that they are lies. First up, in 2003, as Nikki explained, we did achieve decriminalisation. The first lie you hear usually runs like this: New Zealand's insignificant, it's a little country, it's half the size of Sweden, you know. So, you know, Sweden's made a big impact on the world in terms of its model. I believe New Zealand can offer something. We did achieve women's suffrage. We were the first country to do so in, I think, 1894. Perhaps, you know, we have a breakthrough, just like those All Blacks every now and again. We worked very closely with one dedicated MP who worked across party lines to establish this model. We also worked with women's organisations, public health organisations, and people with a deep interest in human rights. So we came at this legislation with quite a wide set. But the thing that joined us together to get it down, to get the template, was indeed the concern about the sex workers. So the legislation itself reflects this concern. It's not about concerns for society. It's about prioritising the rights, health and well-being of sex workers. And that is how it's framed up in the legislation. It's the statement right at the beginning of the legislation. So I'm going to read it to you because I think it's important for the evidence that go down. So the purpose of this act is to decriminalise prostitution. And here's the thing that some MPs came on board with. They were like, a bit squeamish about the strong statement. Is it all right if we hedge a bit and say, we're not quite endorsing or morally sanctioning, so this is in our legislation, So to decriminalise prostitution while not endorsing or morally sanctioning prostitution or its use, and to create a framework that safeguards the human rights of sex workers and protects them from exploitation, promotes the welfare and occupational health and safety of sex workers, and is conducive to public health, prohibits the use and prostitution of persons under 18 years of age, and implements certain other related reforms. So it recognises that decriminalisation in and of itself isn't enough, as Jen acknowledged. So what does it look like on the ground? Well, we decriminalised. We have brothel keepers. They call themselves agents or managers or receptionists. They are allowed to operate brothels as large as you would like. First lie, people always claim that there has been an increase in the number of brothels. Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. But in our experience, the number of brothels increased in relation to the economy, not in relation to legislation. We also have sex workers who are self-governing. Stuart mentioned that they're looking at the New Zealand model to allow for sex workers up to 4 to work together. So sex workers up to 4 equals, can work together and operate their own brothel. If a 5th sex worker comes along to join, they have to get an operator's certificate. So I think that's quite interesting. If you're operating a brothel with more than... if I'm a brothel operator and I am managing one sex worker, then I need an operator's certificate. It's a very light touch in respect to licensing. It's held in confidence by the court. It's not an onerous licensing registration system. Sex workers remain anonymous, which is really important. Sex workers do not have to register their names. However, that doesn't mean they disappear or aren't popping up and presenting. And we've noticed a trend where sex workers are now just declaring that they're sex workers. The number seems to be inching up in settings that are really important. For instance, when you go to the GP or other health facilities, some sex workers are saying, yeah, I'm a sex worker, and people are picking up this trend. They said it never used to happen before decriminalisation. If you can't talk freely and frankly about your sex work, how on earth can you access good quality care that's specific to your needs? So that's an important trend. What we have on the ground, therefore, we have probably about 60% of sex workers work in managed brothels, and the rest are working for themselves. They're able to buddy up. They're able to get together for security. Most don't actually. Most prefer to work independently, but at least the option's there, that the impediment is removed. Before the law changed, the police were adamant that everything would collapse, like controls would be lost and etc., because they had a very active relationship with us. They'd come and record our names diligently. That was the one thing they could do. And so there we were, held on a big, massive database for our own safety, and you can imagine. So what that did to us was, it meant, if we had alternative work, it meant that, if we would, take the example of being a caregiver, you have a police check, and up would pop this sex worker status. So all of that's gone. And I want to focus on the police relationship. It's changed extraordinarily. They are not policing sex workers. They are there, they are adamant about their party line, they are there for support if sex workers need to reach out and get their support. The impediments are removed. What's in the water? That's what people say about New Zealand. What's in the water? I think I had it. But really interesting, the relationship with the police. Sometimes you will hear the naysayers, the anti-lot say, the police are no longer able to work with the sex workers. That's bollocks. That's not true. I can tell you some lovely stories that have hit the world media, actually. The favourite story is about the police on the speakerphone talking to the client. The outreach worker was out there distributing condoms out on the street, and there was this altercation between the pretend client who never intended to pay, and the sex worker was telling the outreach worker, and so they rang the police liaison person, and he said, "Put me on speakerphone," and he asserted that he would be down there on the spot to arrest the pretend client unless he paid up. So, the whole dynamic's changed, and on serious issues like reporting violence too. When I've been at the police station supporting sex workers, the police have been really supportive, really helpful, and it's really interesting because you're getting a whole generation of police officers who cannot understand why the law was the way it was historically. They really are so struck that it just seems a whole world away to have had that culture of arrest and taking people to court, and it just seems so foreign to many of the young police officers. I don't want to paint a completely hallucination picture here. Of course, there are other issues related to the police where they just can't help themselves sometimes. We've had a very tense relationship with some residents in terms of street-based sex work. It's true, we can walk out outside, we can ask anyone for sex. That's always been a law, that's been supported. But for sex workers, when you say, I just want to ask you for sex, but I want you to pay me, all of a sudden people have problems with that. But in New Zealand, we can actually walk out and solicit anywhere, ask for money for sex. And of course we don't do that. We go to traditional areas where sex work generally has happened for decades. And, while some new places have evolved, they evolved before the law changed, a long time back. And we have we have the gentrification issue where residential associations will kick off, and sometimes it's coming from a space of, not having direct contact or direct association with sex workers, but just not liking the fact of their being in the neighbourhood. So, the evidence that's amassed is just made up. The 400% increase of sex workers on the street, you'll hear that figure spouted in many contexts related to sex workers on the go. And I think in New Zealand we've had our share of the 400% increase. Not true. Not true. Backed by evidence. The University Christchurch School of Medicine did a massive study. 773 sex workers were surveyed, along with other interested parties. And the scope of the study, it's online, it's very solid, certainly established what's fact and fiction in respect to numbers increasing, etc. Youth is another area of concern where definitely we have always had people under the age of 18 who have been involved in sex work. The numbers haven't increased since decriminalisation, but the efforts to do something have, about ensuring that youth have as many options available to them as possible. So we have collaborative teams, we have Child, Youth and Family, the Ministry of Social Development and the police and our organisation who work very hard to keep the youth safe. That never happened in such a way in the context of sex work prior to decriminalisation. It couldn't have happened. It's certainly something that came out of decriminalisation. I think the Americans have certainly come down to New Zealand and talked about, this is a trafficking consequence of decriminalisation. Once again, not true. It's not true at all. It's an enormous porcupine. So I think the other area of interest, I guess, is what happens when to those relationships. Hearing Pia talk about all those government agencies who don't care. It's certainly true. You have to negotiate new relationships. The police are pretty much out, but we do have new relationships that we have to work at. With, for example, just before I came, we worked with the medical officers of health. We'd invited them to assist us. There'd been a situation where quite a few sex workers were stressed, and they said, we don't feel we've got the tier of support in management to tell the clients to use the condoms in the same way. And so the medical officers of health said, okay, we'll come in. What would you like us to do? And we're very wary of government interventions because they can get out of hand. But I have to say it has been very respectful, and everyone has been reporting back and saying, oh, it was great to have them come in, and they talked about whether we had health promotion signs up, and sex workers felt supported, which wouldn't have happened before, couldn't have happened before. Our condoms used to be lined up and photographed and presented in court as evidence. So, it's one other kind of tangible piece of evidence, that the authorities are there to support and uphold the rights of sex workers. City councils, we've had some issues, of course, with city councils, but when the law changed, there was a lot of energy coming in, to councils. People were excited and quite titillated that there would be a sex worker everywhere and there'd be brothels everywhere, and because that was what people talked about who were opposed to the legislation. So city councils wound up and created bylaws, sometimes inappropriately heavy-handed, which were then court challenged. And, for example, our largest city, Auckland, was taken to court, and they had to repeal their bylaw, which made it very difficult to establish a brothel anywhere. And similarly in Christchurch, our southernmost, the southern city with the biggest population of sex workers in the southern part of our country, was also challenged. But even city councils are backing off and realising what an overreaction they initially had, and they're quietly letting some of these rules and regulations just expire. We've had a merging of councils in Auckland, and their reaction to the whole issue of decriminalisation and the location of brothels, etc., has tamed down a lot. We've had quite a long time of fighting, though, after decriminalisation for street-based sex work to continue. And even that issue has been quite interesting. We've had bills in the Parliament repealing that piece of the legislation that allows for sex workers to work anywhere on the street. We've had a bill, the most recent one was about the zoning, saying that sex workers couldn't go into specified zones. As an organisation, we had even conceded, actually, that probably there would have to be zoning because we couldn't see that we had any allies. We've got quite a middle-of-the-road conservative parliament, and we thought we'd really lost. So we'd gone in with the police and the city council, and we'd agreed, okay, if we're going to have specified zones where sex workers can't work, at least we'll try and negotiate on this platform to make sure that the harm of new legislation wouldn't be as bad. Surprisingly, this legislation was voted out of the Parliament in February, 109, I think, to 120. And honestly, I just heard that comment about members of Parliament and thinking, like people worry about picking up moral, perceived moral debates, I guess, in most contexts, because you're sticking your head out and so on. But we had Tim Barnett, who sponsored our legislation through. We also had several members of Parliament from the other side, different political parties. They were all re-elected. And, like this idea that, your political career is going to go down, I guess, isn't necessarily so. We've done a lot of research, just a bit of... I've got some little booklets here that summarise. There's also stuff online that you can look at in terms of New Zealand. I want to finish perhaps on a really strong case. We have community centres. A sex worker was coming in again and again. She was reporting about her boss. She said, I don't like the way he talks to me. He demeans me. Not that she used the word demean, but she said, he makes me feel yuck. I just don't feel, he shouldn't be able to say that, And she said, there's got to be something I can do about it. And he was making sexualised comments to her. And she said, it's not right. He shouldn't be able to do that to me. And she didn't know about the Human Rights Review Tribunal. She didn't have that language. But she had this anger and this strong feeling that, the rights could be, the wrongs could be righted. So she took her case, we supported her, but mostly it was her. And she lodged a complaint with the Human Rights Review Tribunal, and it went through a process where she had to give evidence, and the brothel operator, etc., and was giving evidence, and the Human Rights Review Tribunal said no, it's not on. She cannot be sexually harassed by a brothel operator at work. We award $25,000 for harassment, sexual harassment, and to the brothel operator they said that he had to go and do training, sexual harassment training. He baked us a chocolate cake too, So there's lots of anecdotes, and they are real, and they are evidence, and I could go on. We had a police corruption case, which I should mention as well, because that's relevant in so many countries as well. New Zealand doesn't have a corrupt gene in its body in our forces, but actually this police officer was paying for sex, and then he decided he didn't want to, and so he said, look, I'll lose your traffic fines if you continue to give me sexual services. And so that sex worker took the case to the through us to the police, and the police jumped very quickly, and he was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment. Wow. So, you know, there's so many evidence-based stories that are, you know, there and black and white in the media, and, you know, strong evidence through the courts. But I've been given, my time is up. I've crossed all the 7 zones, I hope. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Catherine. That's a really fantastic and useful list of the success of decriminalisation in New Zealand. Okay, so John McDonnell's not going to come yet. I think it's a ploy to make us all come back after lunch. He's coming about 3 o'clock maybe this afternoon. So we'll be looking forward to that. We're taking a break now. We're suggesting 45 minutes. We're running a little bit late. We're running about 15 minutes late. I hope that's okay with people. There's a cafe downstairs. If you didn't bring your own lunch, we should have put that on the publicity, obviously. And we'll meet back here at 2:30. Thank you.